Still ahead, the FDA approving new generic drugs at a record pace as the Trump administration works to deliver on its promise to lower prescription drug prices. We'll talk to FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb about that push and what else is in store next. The Food and Drug Administration stepping up the pace of generic drug approvals. The agency greenlighted 96 generic drugs in July and gave tentative approval to another 30, more than any other month in history. Greater competition from generics is seen as a critical component in lowering the cost of prescription drug prices, a top policy priority for the Trump administration. Dr. Scott Gottlieb is a commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, and welcome. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So on this generic push, the evidence is pretty clear that when you have three generics into brand name plus two generic, it really does reduce drug prices, right?
That's right. If you look at the data, you see the big price declines in a category once you hit the third generic drug. So we've actually prioritized the approval of new generic drugs until there are three drugs within a category.
Okay, so you've also spoken, though, about the way that some of the companies tend to rig the ways generics go into the market to kind of delay the time that there's real competition, or even to some extent kind of wink and nod that we're not going to reduce prices as low as they could be. Explain that.
Well, there's different ways. One of the ones that we find most troublesome, quite frankly, is that the branded companies sometimes make it hard for the generic firms to get access to the physical doses of the drugs, the branded drugs that they need to run what are called bioequivalence and bioavailability studies to prove that the generic drug is the same as the branded drug. They need a generic firm needs anywhere between 2,000 to 5,000 doses of the brand company's drug to run those studies. And what they're doing is they're basically comparing their drug to the brand company drug to prove that they're the same. We know that the brand companies adopt various tactics that make it very hard for the generic firms to go into the market and even paying full price buy the brand company's drug.
How can you force their hand? Is that something the FDA does, or is that the Federal Trade Commission?
Well, we can't force the sale, although I will say that there are countries that do force that sale. In Japan, that sale is mandated, but we can't force them to sell the drug. But what we can do is dismantle some of the policies that they're taking advantage of, the brand companies are taking advantage of, to frustrate the ability of the generic firm to get access to the drug. And one of them are things we call risk management plans, plans that we require brand companies to put in place to make sure the drugs are used responsibly by doctors or by patients, that put in place certain restrictions on how the drugs are used or how they're prescribed. Sometimes we see the brand companies using those same plans as an excuse for not selling the drugs to the generic firms, and so we've tried to stop that.
So President Trump has also, in an attempt to reduce drug prices, talked about reimportation, importing drugs from abroad, but that has been resisted by Congress for a long time. Is that something you support, reimportation?
Well, that's right. Congress has resisted it, and so has the FDA historically, because there's concerns around the safety of importing drugs on a wide basis. But we do currently, in very select cases, for example, when there's a drug shortage, we might import a drug on a temporary basis from a foreign country when we have a shortage of that drug here in the United States. And in that circumstance, we're very carefully managing the import of a drug from a known facility, typically a facility that might have been inspected by the United States or a facility that might have been inspected by a foreign regulator who we trust. And we're guaranteeing the supply chain of that drug. We're guaranteeing that the drug that we're importing is the drug that we seek to import. So we are looking right now, we have a working group, and we're looking at whether or not in very select circumstances where there's a problem with getting access to a drug because of a very big price change, and we're talking about drugs that are off patent, off exclusivity. So an old generic drug where a speculator might come in and boost the price up, by 1,000%, and suddenly patients can't get access to it. We're looking at whether we can use the same policy tools that we might use in a drug shortage situation to also address that access dislocation, that situation where patients suddenly now can't get access to a drug. So we are looking at it.
All right, but let me cite a case for you. As you know, you're dealing with a valsartan, which is a drug that is used for blood pressure pills. A lot of Americans have taken it. Produced by a Chinese company, and it has an ingredient that some people suspect is associated with a higher risk for cancer. Now, how did that get passed the FDA approval process you're talking about for imported drugs?
Well, the short answer is we don't know for sure. I put out a very long statement on this week. We think that there was a manufacturing change in how that drug was manufactured that created an impurity in the drug itself. And, you know, we look at what we call drug master files very carefully to look at where manufacturing changes can create what we call a genotoxic toxicity, a toxicity that could be cancer-causing. And this is, we have people who are expert in organic chemistry to do this. In this case, there's a specific step in the manufacturing of that drug that could create this byproduct, and we think that as they changed their manufacturing, suddenly that byproduct started to be created at higher levels.
Okay, let me ask you about the opioid briefly epidemic. Have we seen a peak in that, do you think, or do we have a long way to go?
Well, I think we have a long way to go. I mean, if you look at prescriptions in the medical setting, they're coming down as I think providers start to rationalize their prescribing. And historically, a lot of the addiction, a lot of the new addiction was out of the medical setting, people who became medically addicted to opioids. So it's a good thing that we're seeing more judicious use of opioids, and that trend needs to continue. But at the same time, we're also seeing rising use of illicit drugs, particularly very potent fentanyl, and that could create a new addiction crisis. And also, as people who get addicted in the medical setting transition off of prescription drugs and onto other things, if what they're transitioning onto is fentanyl in order to continue their addiction, fentanyl is highly potent, highly deadly, and I think that's why we're seeing overdose deaths go up as well.
Okay, well, thanks for that update, Dr. Gottlieb. Appreciate it.